I was walking into graduate school doing a PhD, and I had this epiphanous moment where I stepped back and watched my consciousness, and lo and behold, it was a mess. You know, it was just a bunch of garbage, causing a lot of anxiety, stress, and suffering. And so I said, there must be a better way. There must be some way to not have this be there. And I had no way of knowing that was possible. This was in the early 70s. And so I just set out as a scientist to try to understand if there was a way to stop this endless talking. And so I went off and tried a bunch of little experiments myself, you know, things like how much of my thoughts are about I, me, my, or about not I, me, my. And I find out they're almost all about I, me, my, and nothing about anything else. And they're mostly about the past and the future. And I can't predict my thoughts. I don't think up my thoughts. My thoughts just bounce up into the sky. They just come up. So I just kept doing that. I ran across Ramana Maharshi's teachings. And I got into Zen too. 14th century Zen master called Basui said basically the same things. You know, where am I? When am I? Who am I? And just trying to recognizing that all this self-referential internal narrative is I-based. And if I just tried to understand what the I was, could I look at this? And we've now gotten much smarter. But I just kept asking the questions that worked for me. Where am I and who hears? And I did that and did that and did that and did that. And eventually they stopped. Abruptly, I was doing a yoga posture, went up into it one way, and the thoughts stopped. And I came back down, it was all quiet. And as you may have heard, I had, at the time, 1,000 people working for me, 4 research labs, and a $250 million budget, and I had still mind, completely quiet. There was just nothing in there, like there isn't right now. There's just nothing there. It's not unpleasant, it's not a void, it's just a very sweet stillness. But I had to go to work that day, and I went to work, and lo and behold, nobody noticed. There was no glow, there was no angelic, there were no angels singing, there were no wings or anything. I just went to work, and turned out I was actually more functional than I had been before, because I wasn't losing all the bandwidth to this blah, 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 blah. And I wasn't, you know, losing all the energy that goes along with that. It was just quiet and still. So I'd go to meetings, and I'd be the only person in the room who was actually there for the whole meeting. Everybody else was off someplace else for 10, 20, 30, 40% of the meeting, or doing something else. And so you look like the smartest person in the room, even if you weren't, just because you were there the whole time. So, and I found big complicated jobs of all sorts then and afterwards. You just read the information before you come to the meeting, prepare yourself so you're ready to do something in a meeting, and just sit there and listen to the meeting, fully present. And lo and behold, something comes up that is so much more synchronistic, creative, innovative than anything I could have thought of myself, that you just learn to go with that. And it turns out to be one of those, that's really fantastic. How do you think of that thing? And you just trust it more and more. So, and then I tried to find out, okay, how did this thought stop? What was making those thoughts before? I knew the I, me, my thing, and I deconstructed that, and so thought stopped. But how does the brain do that? You know, what manifests to make that thing occur? And things followed on, and we found out that we've now got all kinds of good technology that explains exactly how it happened. There were a lot of things took place. I mean, one of the big things was getting involved in the Yale long-term meditation work. Judd Brewer, who was at Yale at the time, was looking at 10,000-hour plus or minus Theravada meditators, and found out that in fact this default mode network that we all know about now was being shut down. And there was one key node in that Judd Brewer focused on in his rig at Yale that showed if that center was deactivated, then you didn't have any self-referential thoughts. And you also produced, this was an 11-member construction at the time that makes up selfing, makes up I, me, mying. And you have two core nodes that do most of the work, and they talk to all the other 9 members. And one side of this subnetwork makes a sense of me in time, me with the past, me with the future. And if I deactivate this one core center, then boom, that network shuts down. So I have no sense of me existing through time. I only live in now, 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 which is the classical, mystical experience. And conversely, the other side, the other subnetwork, produces a sense of self and other. Me and you, me and the camera, me in the room. And if that this core shuts down, that also shuts down. And if it shuts down, then you lose this sense of you and other things. And it becomes all as one thing. So you get the 2 big mystical experiences just by shutting down this one node of this selfing network, this 11-member selfing network. And shazam, you're into a psychedelic experience. And Jeffrey Martin did a doctoral thesis on some of us, it's like 36 of us. And you can look and say, well, okay, there's a scale, the Hood mysticism scale. And on that scale, you can be from 35 to 160. Well, he found 36 of us, ran us through those tests, and turns out that, in fact, there were 9 of us who were at the highest level of the Hood mysticism scale, 160. And we were there 90% of the time, 5 of us. So you were persistently in the very highest level of the Hood mysticism scale, which also works for psychedelics. We actually scored higher than the psychedelics people, not much higher, but higher than the psychedelics people. And you can describe this in exactly the same terms. There's good work now coming out of the UK on psilocybin, magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms does the same thing. I mean, they shut down the same centers, basically in the same way that the meditation does it. You just shut down that posterior cingulate cortex, that one yellow node, and you get the mystical experiences. Same subjective reports, the same Hood mysticism scale works for both of them. So we've come to understand exactly how that does, make the big mystical experiences, and they are very similar. The brain, if you call it filtering, the brain creates our realities. And the brain creates this sense of me existing through time. And so if you shut down that network that creates this limitation, or this belief set that I exist through time, and you can see you exist totally now. And now becomes a much more powerful, pregnant place than it was before. It's not just the intersection between past and future, it's actually a hugely different space. Sounds like Eckhart Tolle, but now becomes enormously compelling. As much as you can anthropomorphize about the brain likes this space. The brain does not want to be confused, crazy, anxious. The brain wants to be ordered, get stuff under control here. And that's what happens. I mean, the brain ends up dopaminergically supporting staying in this now space. And the now space gets so sweet and so compelling that you can't get out of it. You almost can't leave it. What happens is you deconstruct the eye gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and you can do some exercise and find out that in fact that there's not one eye, there's thousands of eyes. There's a whole bunch of ayas. And if you do an inquiry process like, when am I, you see that in fact a different person shows up for every different set of relationships. So you can see in the course of a day you have 100 ad hoc eyes come into being as different relationships take place. This is Virginia Woolf now talking about as many relationships as you have, or personalities you have relationships. I mean, we have a whole bunch of ad hoc eyes. So you begin to recognize that these eyes it's not one thing. It's a bunch of little things coming on an ad hoc basis as required. So as they get weakened, you find that they're unable to stop the brain from having this very compelling attraction to this now, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and weaker and less important, and you just find yourself living in this enormous, vast, powerful stillness that's very sweet. You probably heard this story, but I just people I work with who are mostly psychedelic users. I don't choose them for that, but many people who've been around this work for a long time are psychedelic users, and ask them, how do you rank the sweetness of this now compared to sex, drugs, and non-duality? How do you rank those three? And to the person, they said, this persistent non-duality is the sweetest of those three things. It's just a much better place, and the brain generates the neurochemicals to support that. So it is, you live in a psychedelic world. I mean, your world is psychedelic by any measure. When I say no thoughts, and no thoughts isn't just my invention. I mean, Ramana Maharshi said this in the Gadar Maharaj, it's in the Tao Te Ching, it's in the Yoga Sutras, it's in the Bhagavad Gita, it's all over the place. When my Zen masters passed me on the basis of having this situation and some other questions. So no thoughts is not like my invention. This has been around for a long, long, long time. And no thoughts, most people's, when they think of thoughts, is this ongoing narrative, this self-referential, internal, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't preclude you having thoughts about planning or about problem solving. That's a whole other network. You go from this default mode network, which creates this thing we just talked about, and you can still have thoughts if you read to yourself when you read, if you work through something like, how are we going to talk about today's interview, talk to yourself about that. But when it moves over from talking about today's interview into, OMG, this is really, what's going to happen today? Then you can see the transition from pure planning that doesn't have any emotional investiture, and the I is just coded in because our language has an I in it automatically. It moves over into a self-referential emotional narrative. And the brain, almost surgically, can split between those two. It can recognize when you move from, how do I get to I-99, or how do I ever get down to 101 in the afternoons, over to, okay, I just have stillness. And the brain can cut that very cleanly. Amazingly, it can do that. But you can parse that out, and this place is just very still virtually all day. In my case, if my blood sugar gets very low, or I get very tired, thoughts can start up again. I mean, self-referential thoughts can start again. And so we think we know why that's the case. There are two centers in the brain that appear to watch over this network being shut down. And they're probably very low in the priority list for energy allocation, for glucose allocation. And so they probably get dropped off first. If it's I have to run away from the lion, or I need to make sure my default mode network isn't operating so I can have a quiet mind, you better go for the lion thing. And so the brain seems to recognize, the brain is a smart thing, recognize this, in fact, okay, I can stay down here, feed this, and let that go for now. And I think that's what happens when those come back up again. So the brain, it's not dead, but it is not acting. It's just not there, but it's there naturally. Absolutely. Yeah, and that was Ramana Maharshi's genius. He said, forget about the objects of your consciousness, your thoughts and sensations and breath, and forget about those. You'll never resolve those. If you could resolve them, Woody Allen wouldn't have made any great movies. So psychoanalytically, you can't resolve those things. So you just go back and just focus on the subject. It's all about the subject. Any way you can, try to understand it. Don't beat it to death, but just understand it and keep asking questions about it. And eventually the brain seems to pick up on these questions, like the when am I thing we talked about, where you say, well, the brain sees this. It sees it, in fact, it's, thousands of leases, or Zayas, so thousands of Zayas. It says, well, why am I all excited about this one? And eventually the brain will learn its way through this thing. You give it enough still data points, the brain will focus on this tasking network, which is over here, pretty much, as opposed to this default mode network. It will just not go here, because this is so much more sweet, useful, functionally compelling, and this is really not do much of value. So we've learned how to parse out those kind of thoughts. You can also do This is semantic, basically. It's informational processing, informational memory. And this is mostly episodic. You know, I had this bad experience type memory. And you can lose this, and you can still keep this. In fact, this functions even better. No, au contraire. Okay, yes. Well, we broke off from the chimpanzees 6 million years ago, basically, plus or minus. And for the first, 4 or 5 million years, we mastered taking a rock and sharpening one side of it. So we weren't doing exceptionally well. Things accelerated from then, but as far as we know, this whole symbolic logic is probably 75,000 years old at the most. So out of 6 million years, this evolved probably 75,000 years ago. So a relatively very short time evolutionarily. And it really kicked into operation strongly probably 30 years, 30,000, 20,000 years ago when we formed agriculture. We moved from hunting and gathering into more complicated structured societies. And we developed an eye. We killed a zebra over there. And we decide, you can have half the zebra, and remember, though, that I've given you half the zebra, so next time when you kill a zebra and I don't, then you'll share it back with me. So we developed this I, symbolic logic. We first started to scratch into ochre, that we had we could use symbols to represent things, but that's the evolution of symbolic logic, which is relatively very recent. And that's how we were for 5.5 million years. And we developed this egoic structure. And you can say, well, is it still useful? I mean, it evolved and it served some purpose because it manifested. You say, well, okay, has it fulfilled its usefulness? When we had to divide up who's going to do the farming tasks, it was very important. And we got complicated hierarchical societies, very important. But now you watch what goes on up here, and almost nobody would agree that it's really a productive, useful asset. I mean, compared to what takes place in this tasking network, what takes place in this network now is there are no lions and tigers and bears for most people. What's up there now is just, oh, what did Mary say? Was John thinking this about me, or was John thinking that about me? We developed this massive prefrontal cortex largely based on relationships. Does she like me? Does he like me? Why did they say that thing? Did I screw up in that last presentation? Whatever it is, it's all imagined problems from the past or projected outcomes in the future, which in my experience, I'm always wrong about. I mean, I had no problem letting go of future forecasts because I was no good at it. If you watch your future forecasts, I was 0 for a bazillion because I was always wrong some way. It was never exactly correct. So you realize after a while, this is just not a useful process. It's always a problematic process. So right now, I would say most people, there's a really good study at UVA that I had in a blog post about exactly this, about how much people hate this internal self-referential narrative. I mean, they had a bunch of students, and the end of the study, it was published in Science, so a big journal, they could shock themselves on the ankle, or they could sit there by themselves for 15 minutes and entertain themselves with their thoughts with no toys. They had to just sit there. And many of them chose to shock themselves in the ankle with a painful shock rather than be subjected to having to just sit there with their own thoughts. So this is not a good thing. They did students, and they did people from the farmer's market, they did people from the church in Charlottesville, and they found the same thing with all of them. People don't like this self-referential internal narrative. So if it's become so unpleasant and so maladaptive, it causes all of our stress and suffering and concerns, why don't we just say, can we get another operating system? Can we evolve out of this operating system into something that's, version 2 or version 3? This is a relatively recent adaptation. It came in for a reason during agriculture. But now we've been good at agriculture. Not many people in many parts of the world are worried about food, but they do obsess about everything else. And so, for me, it was a good trade. I mean, getting rid of the obsessive, self-referential, suffering-causing unhappiness and moving off into a place which is so much sweeter and you're so much better functional. Your life goes along so much more smoothly than it did before. To me, it's the next evolutionary step for a better operating system. Yes, that was good. Before we chipped rocks, then we found a way to do agriculture. We've now moved into a whole different world. In the last 10,000 years, dramatic evolution in our species. It's happening too fast for evolution to catch up with it. So I'm proposing we just start looking at it and say, can we find a way to get to a new operating system, a better operating system? I didn't find I was any good at that. I mean, as much as I tried to understand my emotions and try to, go back and say, well, why did I react that way to her in this particular situation? You try to deconvolute that psychologically. And I think psychology community in some ways for me is broken down. You look at DSM-5, the latest description of what's a psychotherapeutic malady, and the chairman of that, you probably know this story, the chairman of that resigned before they published DSM-5 because he said everybody fits someplace in one of these DSM-5 designations. There's nobody who is not psychopathologizable, that you can't make them into a problem. And I think that's where we've come with psychology. I mean, they don't have a way to deal with almost anything, so they just pathologize everything. I mean, if you went to this conference with some very bright people here, you could probably psychopathologize virtually everybody. I bet everybody here would flunk someplace in DSM-5. I know if I was a kid now, I'd have a hard time not seeing a school psychologist. So I just think that part of the system's broken down. We had been trying, and on the very first SAND, there was a parallel path here for some of the Bay Area people, so we had to do a psychological training program for how to deal with people with non-duality. Because what happens now, if you have non-duality, and you go to a typical psychologist, you'll be depersonalization disorder. First diagnosis. Used to be schizophrenia, but now they've got a more elegant thing they call depersonalization disorder. And I say, guilty as charged. As if your person is this I that's back there causing all these problems, that's the person that I deed that. I wanted that to go away. And you can deconstruct that. But it's not pathological. On the contrary, we need to understand that it's really maybe the next best step. I don't think psychology, unless they look a different way, maybe neuroscientifically, at how these things emerge, are they going to understand what's really going on? Because they've got a big phenomenon here with a real problem, that people don't like what's going on with this thing. I'm a complete virgin. I'm virgin on psychedelics. But the guy I do videos with, we have lots of dialogues, Richard Doyle and I, he's used them all. Yeah. And used many of them. Yeah. And he's written books on them. He's well known for this. So, Rich Doyle. Yeah, he's no, he's a professor at Penn State. And we did maybe 30-some dialogues, because I'm a virgin and he's not. And so we bring very different perspectives to a lot of questions in this work, where you say, well, if you're experiencing something psychedelic, is that true? And it turns out it is true. I mean, we talk about what my world looks like and what his world in psychedelics looked like, and he says it's the same thing. If I talk to people who use a lot of psychedelics, they say, yeah, that's exactly what my thing is. So we've cross-compared a lot, but I do find, and this is, I get stoned for this a fair amount, that when I work with people one-on-one, I find that if they've done some serotonergic psychedelics, if they've done especially the more learning-focused psychedelics, if they've done ayahuasca, if they've done magic mushrooms, there's a learning that goes into that that makes the process of being non-dual much, much, much easier. You might, we don't have any good numbers yet statistically, but you might take as much as 80% of the time out of time required to do this change by doing that. I mean, I've had work with some people who that's about what we've gotten. Within 900 hours, someone's gotten to a place where it would take most people 10,000 hours without psychedelics. And we don't know, certainly it gives people, because there's some scary places, even without psychedelics, just doing non-dual meditation for a long time, you hit some really scary places. And it may just be that you've seen those scary places before on psychedelics, and so you aren't afraid anymore, and you just say, well, this is okay. I know the brain can make up all kinds of worlds. This is just another world the brain's manifesting, chemically or non-chemically, endogenously or exogenously. And so you just say, well, okay, this is not a problem. We don't know scientifically yet if, in fact, somehow we're conditioning those synapses between different neurons by having psychedelic exposure, so that then the chemicals, then your body, your natural endogenous chemicals work better, work differently. But it certainly does almost 100% of the time. If someone's done, 20 isn't better than 5. 100's, in fact, I know one guy who's done 2,000 high-dose LSD things, and he's not there. That's not solving his problem. But some exposure is helpful, and I'm not pimping for psychedelics, but that is, a conclusion you come to, at least anecdotally. What I do now, since there's, the doer's not much use anymore, I still get up in the morning, like I always have, for 2 hours, and whatever manifests, spontaneously. I just sit there, and whatever happens, happens. My first yoga training was that you just spontaneously let postures generate. And so I spontaneously let whatever asanas there need to come up, they come up. Whatever chanting needs to come up, I'm a big chanter. Chanting comes up. If I need to meditate, I meditate. If it's breathing practices happen. And every day it's different. And every day something happens. I mean, people say, oh, I'm done. Oh, I've stopped anything. I'm enlightened now, whatever. For me, it never stops. If you've got 50 trillion synaptic interconnections, if only 2% of those, you've still got trillions of neurons involved in this thing. This is a complicated rearrangement we're doing up here. And it takes a long time to get rid of those, plus all your old memories. But I find every day, a key turns in the lock. Something happens, something changes, a new piece of insight. You thought you understood and saw before, but now you see something that's different than it was yesterday, clearer in a different way. So, yeah, I still do it a couple hours a day. Yeah. People do all kinds of extrapolations from chance events. And if you look at the history of awakened people who speak at these conferences, it could have been walking across a park in London. It could have been walking down a road and kicking a stone against the bamboo fence, which is one of the big Zen awakenings. One guy went to a whorehouse. I mean, so people sometimes often confuse, oh, I did this thing and therefore this is the important event. I mean, kicking stones against the bamboo is what it did, so I just stand here all day and kick stones against the bamboo and it'll wake me up. It doesn't work that way. But I think this may either have been just incidental, but then, who's the guy who writes Zen in the Brain? He talks here. He's talked here several times. Zen in the Brain. I can't think of his name right now. Very famous researcher.
Zen practitioner.
Yeah, big long-term Zen practitioner, also a scientist, neuroscience. We're the first good neuroscience. Almost had his name. I may think of it. But anyway, he came to a talk 2 years ago here, and I gave my psychedelic plus or minus talk. And he got a hold of Roland Griffiths, who runs the psilocybin program at Hopkins. Yeah, he was also talking. And so they were both in my session. And so we gathered afterwards out in the hallway and blah, 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 and started talking. And the guys whose name I can't think of said, how are you, he asked Roland. We talked, and then he left, and Roland's still there. And we started talking. Roland said, well, his question is, what position were you in? What yoga posture were you doing? And I told Roland what I was doing, the posture. He said, that's exactly what he predicted, that it would be one aspect of that posture would be what would trip you over. And so, I can't think of the guy's name. I can see his face, he's a great guy. Anyway, but he predicted what elements the posture would have in it that would have caused me to flip over. So it may have been something non-incidental, that it was exactly that posture at that particular time was the last penny that had to fall. I don't know over the course of 25 years and 20,000 hours of practice what exactly happened at that moment. I was very singular. I was just watching on a DIY basis what was happening with self-referential thought. And the only question was, is it gone or not? And as long as it was up there, then it wasn't done. And so I had many waking experiences and lots of stuff happened along the way, but all my teachers says, forget about the experiences. It's not about the experiences are traps. You'll find yourself trying to go back and replicate an old experience, and we now know from a bunch of studies, we don't remember anything from the past accurately. Even things like 9/11 or Lady Di, we just don't remember them well. After a year, forget about that being an accurate memory. But I spent like years trying to get back to my first experience until I learned it was not going to get me there. But I just kept practicing and asking the questions and inquiring and letting go and surrendering, and I'm not this body. I just kept going and going and going. I thought I wasn't going to make it. I just thought I just wasted 25 years of 2 hours a day or more for nothing. And surrender became very important. I mean, surrender turned out to be huge. And I could tell I wasn't surrendering everything. I was holding back for my 2 daughters. And so I just held on to them. And I could tell that was a sticking post. I had not let go of my attachment to my daughters. And so once I got them where they were okay and safe in school, I let go. I said, okay, whatever happens to me, and I had no idea what was going to happen. I really had not the foggiest what was going to happen. I was prepared to lie along the curb and slobber. If that's what it turned out to be, I had to know the truth. So I let go. Surrendered my daughters, completely surrendered everything. Turned out I needed somebody to surrender to. I surrendered to Ramana Maharshi. I said, you take them. And 2 days later it happened. So it was, you keep letting go of every attachment you have until you find your last attachment. And then that's what mine was, and I let go of that last attachment, and then soon thereafter, bang. So that to me was a singular event that made it all go. I've been letting go of other attachments, but I came down to my last one, and I knew what it was. I just wouldn't let go of it. And I did. Well, I mean, to me, I anthropomorphize it. I mean, into the brain as being a living entity, because it is a living entity. We have this little tiny CPU up on top, this rider in the elephant metaphor that I use. It's a very tiny little thing. A little CPU can do 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, solve one problem at a time. And down here we have, the wonder of the universe. 100 billion neurons, 50 trillion synaptic interconnections, massive parallel processors. There's a reason we evolved to have this press secretary with not much capability and have this thing offline. So you don't know what's going on. The problem is we believe we know what's going on by listening to what's going on in the blah, blah, blah. In fact, it doesn't have a clue what's happening. I mean, the stuff offline is massively complicated and probably goes on continuously. We just don't have any idea what's happening until we can get somebody, I think if we're getting towards EEG that can really do good measurements deep in the brain, we're getting very close on that. We'll have a better marker, but we just don't really know what's going on under there. Other than we just listen to our stories about ourselves, and it's always wrong. She was hostile. She was completely hostile to the whole thing. And this was back in the 70s and 80s, and it wasn't, part of the mainstream at all, part of almost any stream at all. There was a fringe that was doing yoga and some meditation, but not broad population like now. She was very threatened by it, very hostile to it. She told me one time if I ever started to teach, she'd leave me. So great hostility towards this thing. The hostility didn't really end until there was a billionaire standing in our living room. And when she saw the billionaire standing in our living room, she said, well, there must be something to this because we got a billionaire in our living room right now. And that changed the whole thing. And it is difficult for your partner because your partner is used to you being a certain way and having buttons that you learn how to push on each other. You each know how the other person responds to certain things, and you expect that behavior to always be there, whether it's productive or non-productive, it's there. And so suddenly one person stops responding that way. They don't respond, the buttons don't work anymore. And first thing is, well, he's got another woman or whatever. But it was worse than that. I mean, it wasn't worse than another woman. It was something you don't understand, what doesn't understand, and it's weird. There's no institutional support for it. Nobody understands it. And you're doing this weird thing all these hours. It just doesn't make any sense to a wife, to most wives. So a lot of men in divorce and a lot of them travail and trauma. But they don't understand it. I empathize with them. But in the end, it does work out. At least it did in our case. I mean, and you end up seeing each other much more clearly. I mean, if you don't come to your relationship with your partner or your kids or something without a storyline, without some way they have to be or some way they used to be that you're holding against them, if you just come to them where they are right now, it's very different. Stuff can change. And you see the other person much more clearly. That's the only way to really love and to be compassionate. We had this big discussion about compassion. I mean, if I come to you as someone who has something, money, and I'm giving it to you down there to help you so I can get karma points or sin points or anti-sin points, that's not compassion to me. It's not love. I mean, love comes when there's nobody here, there's nobody there. It's just love, just total love expressing. And there's nothing in the way of it. There's no storyline, there's no, I'll love you if you give me that. I'll give you this if you give me something back again. So much of it's a marketplace. But if you just come to somebody completely openly, a whole other quality of love, compassion, whatever emerges, that is so totally different from what you used to think love was or what compassion was. So totally different and so much more useful and real and present.